Metroid Dread is a big deal. It's the first official 2D Metroid game with an original story that's tied into the series' overall plot in more than a decade. Both fans and newcomers to the series have been anticipating something like it ever since Nintendo teamed up with MercurySteam to make Samus Returns back in 2017. Now that game is here, and it would be an understatement to say that people are excited. Most reviewers who have covered this game are practically raving about it. They're ecstatic. They say it's got fantastic gameplay, a real palpable sense of fear that comes from high difficulty and a lot of tense escape sequences, and a story more gripping and emotional than most Metroid games period, let alone recent Metroid games. However, as you may have gathered from the video I put out a month ago, I had some serious reservations about Dread's story and where it was taking the Metroid franchise. So when it came out, I decided to watch a playthrough of it on YouTube to get some idea of what the game was like in action. And the truth is that, in action, the game looked pretty good, certainly an improvement over Samus Returns. There's more variety in the enemy design, more tension and challenge in the combat, and a much stronger sense of purpose to the way you explore and find upgrades. From a mechanical standpoint, Metroid Dread is unquestionably a step in the right direction. But of course, even more than Samus Returns, Dread is not just a set of game mechanics. It's also a story. And if my misgivings about where this franchise was headed were softened by seeing how this game plays, it was only to have them replaced by an even more disturbing set of misgivings about what Metroid means and what it stands for. My feelings about Dread are complicated, and I honestly can't think of an adequate way to explain them, which is why I'm going to take the easy way out and let somebody else do it. Back in June of 2016, a very underrated and now sadly defunct YouTuber called Mr. B-Tongue put out a video criticizing the approach taken by the creators of the Game of Thrones TV series. In particular, he was annoyed at their tendency to take many different characters from the original books and rewrite them into the same kind of stock heroic/kind of anti-heroic archetype, a badass. Here's how he put it back then.
In the book series, Daenerys Targaryen is a young woman suddenly thrust into a position of immense complexity and responsibility. For all that her experience exceeds her years, she is still a teenager, still confused, still emotional, still unsure. And yet she turns this vulnerability into a sort of wisdom and becomes a unique and even admirable manager of the nearly hopeless political quagmire that is Myrene. In the show, Dani is a total badass. Remember the time when she locked those people in that safe thing? Or the time she dropped the whip like a mic? Or the other time she burned all those dudes to death in that one place? That was awesome!
And this is how I'm feeling right now. In Metroid Fusion, Samus Aran is a powerful bounty hunter who suddenly gets thrust into a relatable position of powerlessness when her life is threatened by a devastating illness. However, a vaccine containing the DNA of the last Metroid brings her back from the edge, at the cost of radically transforming her appearance and abilities. As she attempts to destroy the X-parasites with only a fraction of her former strength, Samus is left to ponder many disturbing things: the thin line between life and death, the horror of entire species going extinct and being replaced by the X, and the question of what it really means to be human. In Metroid Dread, Samus is a total badass. Remember the time she shot that lizard in the face and then leaped through its tail right before it died? And then when Kraid shot that stomach thing at her and she just casually dodged to the side like Han Solo? Or when Ravenbeak was all choking her and like, leave the galaxy to me, but then she just screamed and turned to a Metroid and frickin' owned him? It was so epic, dude! But the truth is that this kind of thinking, this idea that Samus is a planet-exploding badass above all else, didn't start with Metroid Dread. It didn't even start with the acrobatic leaping and wrestling moves that MercurySteam introduced to the franchise with Samus Returns. The roots of this go way back, at least to the end of the Metroid Prime trilogy in the late 2000s. Up to this point, most Metroid games had spent very little time attempting to characterize their protagonist or give her a prominent role in the story. Samus spoke very infrequently, and when she did, usually in introductory cutscenes, she was concise and unemotional. If she left any impression at all, it was that of a calm, stoic professional who was unruffled by her job and the enormous challenges associated with it. One exception to this general rule was Metroid Fusion, one of only 2 games in the series to feature a continuous internal monologue that showed Samus's thoughts to the player. In Fusion, Samus was still a courageous and stoic hero, but also one who doubted herself and worried about the unimaginable threats she was facing. For the first time, Samus was shown disobeying orders from the Galactic Federation, having a violent argument with her commander, and showing sympathy for the creatures that she interacted with, including Metroids. Metroid Fusion was a very different and considerably more complicated story than any which had appeared in Metroid before, which makes it a little odd that Nintendo didn't really attempt to follow through on it at all. The next game, Zero Mission, was a remake of the original Metroid, with the only real story content being a cutscene which, very briefly, showed Samus's childhood on Zebes with the Chozo. And at the same time, the Prime series carried on with a trilogy of stories that had nothing to do with Samus or her past. These were interesting stories, but they weren't character-focused, and made very little attempt to flesh out Samus's personality. But then, out of the blue, the third Prime game took a small step in the direction previously trodden by Fusion. For the first time, Samus teamed up with other bounty hunters, became friends with them, and then was forced to destroy them when they became corrupted. This added even more emotions to those which Samus had shown in Fusion. At first, camaraderie and excitement, which later turned to sorrow and grief. This was the first 3D Metroid game to show Samus reflecting on her experiences and confronting the painful memories that were an unavoidable consequence of her just doing her job. And even though Retro Studios didn't end up creating the next Metroid game after the Prime trilogy, it was obvious at this point that Nintendo's creative team, including the lead scenario designer, Yoshio Sakamoto, was no longer satisfied with the stoic, unshakable figure that Samus still was in the eyes of many. Having proven that he could tell a real story by making Metroid Fusion, Sakamoto in particular clearly wanted to take the next step and make a dramatic, cinema-quality experience out of the raw materials that composed Metroid. This was going to be not another exploratory romp with Samus as an impartial observer, but a story about Samus and all her nuances. It would be, fingers crossed, the most sophisticated and mature story of the entire series, maybe even in a Nintendo game period. Of course, that's not exactly the way it turned out. Other M ended up feeling more like a soap opera in space than the psychological thriller the team had envisioned. Samus's internal monologues, which were supposed to sound deep and introspective, instead sounded like something a 13-year-old would write in her diary. Adam's coldness made him look more like an insufferable asshole than a father figure, and story beats which were supposed to be impressive fell completely flat thanks to poor character motivation and some truly astonishing plot holes. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people, including Nintendo, learned the wrong lesson from the disaster that was Other M. The game had a bad story and was pretentious to boot. That was the problem. But a lot of people blamed everything on the fact that the game was too story-driven and had Samus talk too much. It was actually quite similar to the effect that Skyward Sword had on the Zelda franchise, in that one badly written story was enough to convince many fans not that the stories needed to be better, but that having a story focus at all was wrong. Admittedly, Samus's constant internal monologue in Other M was irritating, but the intention behind it wasn't entirely misguided. Sakamoto was trying to show that Samus wasn't a one-note character, a silent, stoic badass who went around casually disintegrating aliens without feeling any kind of emotion in the process. People don't act the same way all the time. Stress and the grip of strong emotions can make people act in unexpected ways. This was the kernel of truth behind that ridiculous Ridley fight where Samus got PTSD and freaked the hell out. And however much people hated that scene, the fact that it was ham-fisted doesn't discredit the whole idea of making Samus vulnerable every once in a while. Fusion did something very similar with the SAX, but it did it well, and in the process established that Samus was a human being, someone the player could relate to instead of just cheering her on as she shoots aliens and blows things up. But then we come to Samus Returns, and here we can see clearly that Samus has gone back to being someone who just shoots aliens and blows things up. My biggest problem with Samus Returns never had anything to do with game mechanics or structure. It was simply the fact that Samus, a human being, was now punching giant aliens in the face, prying open their jaws to machine gun them in the mouth, and just generally acting more like a cyborg ninja from Metal Gear than the relatively down-to-earth character she used to be in previous games. With Metroid Dread, this transformation goes even farther. The focal point of the entire game is Samus turning into the ultimate warrior and screaming while she bashes and shoots evil robots and aliens and Chozo into powder. The boss fights all end with cutscenes that exist only to let her do even more badass things that MercurySteam couldn't figure out how to let you do yourself. By the end, she's turned into a literal monster who can kill anything by touching it, and is only changed back by a plot development that comes out of nowhere and makes no sense. I've heard a lot of people say that Dread has a very tense and unsettling atmosphere, but I have to disagree with that. Tension is a product of a conflict between what a player already knows and what they anticipate knowing in the future. And in Dread, there is never a time when you know only a little bit about the threats facing you. Generally, you either know nothing about what's happening, or you know so much that there's no tension. Dread doles out its exposition in huge chunks at the beginning, middle, and near the end of the game. After the first half hour, you not only know everything you need to know about the Emmy, you've also already destroyed one, and know that the same technique will eventually work on all of them. This completely contradicts the idea of them being invulnerable, and it means that from that moment on, any fear the player feels from them is mechanical, not emotional. What you end up being afraid of is that the game will make you restart a difficult section of gameplay, not that these robots may actually be indestructible. In the middle of the game, you get a 5-minute cutscene in which the entire backstory is explained by a character who essentially knows everything. Samus literally sits on the floor like she's in kindergarten while the story is spoon-fed to her, and as soon as the cutscene is over, the narrator is killed off, as if to prevent the merest possibility of him being involved in more plot developments. Metroid Fusion, which is the game Dread was inspired by, even though it has virtually nothing in common with it design-wise, had a very different approach to the story. Fusion's plot was driven forward by a succession of chess-like moves and counter-moves between Samus and the X-Parasites. As soon as she gets missiles, they knock out an elevator. She uses a data room, they destroy the data room. She gets through areas with ordinary weapons, they turn into barriers that resist everything but power bombs, and so on. This was scary because it suggested that the X were learning. It made it seem like all the upgrades Samus had acquired were just one step in an arms race that might be won by either side. By contrast, the X and Dread don't really seem to learn anything at all. They don't even get to the point where they flee from Samus because they know she'll absorb them, which is something that happened about an hour into Fusion. It's a huge letdown that underscores just how little MercurySteam cared about any aspect of the plot that wasn't directly related to Samus and the main villain. In their single-minded pursuit of making Samus look cool and powerful, MercurySteam completely forgot not only about Samus's other characteristics, but also about the overarching saga that this game is technically a part of. You would think that the last part of a story arc would be dedicated to bringing together and resolving all the plot threads that previous games had brought up. But the truth is that there really were no plot threads unresolved after Metroid Fusion. So instead, Dread makes up its own, entirely different conflict involving a new planet, a new villain, and a backstory that was only mildly hinted at in a single previous game. All the made-up Chozo lore and melodramatic cutscenes in the world can't disguise the fact that Metroid Dread has no real place or purpose in the mainline story of this franchise. This is a supposed finale to the Metroid story that has nothing to do with either the Space Pirates or the Galactic Federation, meaning that it has virtually no connection to the first or third entries in the series, and only a tangential connection to the second. The only other Metroid game that Dread actually has close ties to is Samus Returns, but these two games don't constitute a complete story on their own. Metroid fans are in the awkward position of trying to make a coherent saga out of a first game made in 2005, a second game in 2017, a third one in 1994, a fourth one in 2002, and a fifth one in 2021. But because of the radical changes that MercurySteam has made to Samus's character and the game's overall tone, I would argue that this series simply doesn't fit together anymore. It's a Frankenstein's monster at this point, and having a computer call Samus Lady doesn't help. Honestly, if you like the story in Metroid Dread, I get that. It's not a bad story taken on its own terms. But as a conclusion to a long-running series, it's a flop, and it has virtually nothing in common with the one game that it shares plot elements with. If you like this game's take on Samus, I understand that too. She's never been more powerful or more emotional than she is in this game. But the Samus that I always thought was cool was the one who used her brain, not the one who was really good at punching things. I can't stand in the way of change. Lots of fans love this new take on Metroid, and it seems set to be a huge financial success. Just because I don't like the way MercurySteam makes video games doesn't mean it's wrong, any more than Metroid Fusion was wrong for taking an exploration-based series and making it linear and story-focused, or than Other M was wrong for trying to give Samus a heart as well as a brain. I said in my previous video that it looked like Dread was going to be better than Samus Returns, and despite my reservations, I definitely still think that's true. But I don't have to like it. Oh, also, one more thing. Jesus Christ, Adam's digitized voice in this game was god-awful. Seriously, Nintendo, you're a big company. If you have to have voiced dialogue instead of just text, bite the bullet and pay a voice actor already. This Tomodachi Life bullshit just isn't gonna cut it.